Security, can you escort this woman out? She's standing in the investor lobby, and she clearly doesn't belong. That's what the receptionist said. Loud, clear, in front of everyone. The woman they were talking about? Black, alone, holding a sealed portfolio. Not loud, not disruptive, just present. And that was enough to make her a threat. No one asked her name. No one asked why she was there. A man in a $1,000 suit walked in behind her, didn't even show ID. He was waved through. She was asked if she was lost. She wasn't. She had an appointment with the CEO. But that didn't matter. Not when your skin walks into the room, before your resume ever gets the chance. And while they whispered about her outfit, questioned her intentions, and chuckled behind glass doors about her ambition, they didn't know the truth. Not yet. They didn't know who was watching, or that the woman they just humiliated would become the reason this company collapses from the inside. She didn't have to shout. She didn't have to threaten. She just had to wait. And when the time came, she wouldn't demand justice. She would deliver it. Have you ever seen someone get dismissed before they ever open their mouth? What would you have done if you were standing there? Let us know in the comments, and tell us where you're watching from. And if you want to know how this ends, how one quiet woman brought an entire empire to its knees, like this video, subscribe, and don't blink. Angela Mitchell stepped through the glass doors of Halcyon Strategies, incorporated with the quiet dignity of someone who had learned long ago not to expect courtesy, only to command it through patience. The lobby gleamed with marble floors and a wall of living plants that seemed designed more to impress investors than to welcome people. Her heels tapped softly against the polished surface as she approached the reception desk, where two women sat behind matching Macs, their acrylic nails clattering over keyboards in practiced disinterest. One of them, Heather, was in the middle of applying lip gloss, only barely glancing up as Angela stopped in front of her. "Yes," Heather said flatly, not bothering to look her in the eye. Angela smiled gently, unfazed. "Good morning. I have a 10 a.m. appointment with Mr. Maxwell, office 52F. Heather paused for a fraction of a second, her brow twitching at the mention of that name, before her face settled into a familiar look of veiled suspicion. "Are you sure? What's your name again?" "Angela Mitchell." Heather gave a tight smile that didn't reach her eyes. She turned to her screen, typing something in slowly. At that moment, a young intern in a powder blue button-up leaned against the counter behind the desk and snickered. He whispered just loud enough for Heather to hear, but the words carried. "Didn't know we were doing community outreach today." Angela heard it. She heard everything, but her expression remained unchanged, her voice steady. Heather continued, "You said Maxwell? As in Robert Maxwell, the director?" Angela nodded once. Heather scoffed under her breath, barely hiding her disbelief. "Do you have a confirmation email?" Angela calmly reached into her tote and pulled out a printed letter on official Halcyon Strategies letterhead, complete with a watermark. She slid it across the counter. Heather stared at it for a long moment, as if searching for something to discredit, then slowly nodded. "I see." She pressed a button to call up the elevator, but didn't say another word. "No, have a seat. No, he'll be right with you." Just cold silence. Angela took a breath, turned, and walked to one of the sleek leather chairs by the window. Around her, suited men and women moved with purposeful strides, some glancing at her in passing with curiosity, others not at all. She sat down, legs crossed, back straight, her hands resting on a neatly bound portfolio across her lap. From behind the desk, the intern muttered again, this time louder. "She seriously thinks she's pitching something here? Looks like she got off the subway 5 minutes ago." Heather laughed, not caring that Angela could hear. Angela didn't flinch. Instead, she pulled out her phone, checked the time, and then opened a folder on her tablet. Diagrams, data sheets, federal grant approvals. Everything she had prepared for this meeting was laid out, structured, calculated to precision. A man in an expensive navy suit strode in and went straight to the desk. Heather perked up instantly. "Mr. DeLuca, always a pleasure," she chirped. "Morning," he replied, all charm, glancing toward Angela for a moment before turning back to the desk. "I'm headed up to see Maxwell." Of course. Go right on up, Heather said sweetly, buzzing him through without asking for ID. Angela watched the exchange with a flicker of interest, but still said nothing. She knew the difference between being treated as expected and being tolerated. She had walked this line her entire adult life. After 10 minutes, she stood again and approached the desk. "Excuse me, just checking. Was Mr. Maxwell informed I've arrived?" Heather blinked slowly, feigning surprise. "Oh, right. Let me call up now." She picked up the phone, pressed a button, and said in a rehearsed tone, "Hi, yes, I have an Angela Mitchell here. Says she has a 10 o'clock with Mr. Maxwell." "MHM, okay, thank you." She set the phone down, face unreadable. "He'll be down in a moment." Angela returned to her seat, her presence as composed as ever. But in her mind, she was filing away every detail, every glance, every whisper, every delay. Not as fuel for vengeance, but as context, as proof. 10 more minutes passed before the elevator pinged and the doors opened. A tall, sharp-featured man in his late 50s stepped out, glancing around the lobby before his eyes landed on Angela. A flicker of recognition brightened his face. "Ms. Mitchell," he said warmly, striding toward her with a hand extended. "So glad you could make it. I apologize. My team didn't inform me you'd already arrived." Angela shook his hand firmly, then glanced at Heather. Heather froze, lips parting slightly. "No trouble at all," Angela replied, her tone gracious. "I'm used to being overlooked." Heather turned red. The intern had suddenly found something fascinating on his phone. Maxwell gestured toward the elevators. "Shall we?" Angela nodded and walked with him, portfolio in hand, her posture regal. As the doors closed, Heather exhaled, realizing only then that this woman, whom she had treated as unworthy of being seen, was walking into the top executive's private office. But the receptionist didn't yet know the full weight of what Angela represented, or how much that one meeting upstairs would shape the company's future. And neither did anyone else. As the elevator doors closed behind Angela and Mr. Maxwell, the buzz of the lobby seemed to shift ever so slightly. Heather, still watching the empty space where Angela had stood moments ago, nervously adjusted the collar of her blouse, glancing toward the intern, who now seemed far too busy to meet her eye. Upstairs, Maxwell chatted amiably with Angela about the meeting structure, apologizing once more for the confusion. "Don't worry," Angela replied calmly. "I understand how first impressions can be complicated in certain places." Maxwell chuckled, not quite catching the subtext. As the elevator reached the executive floor, they stepped into a quiet hallway lined with glass-walled offices and framed accolades. The sleek, professional ambience carried a coldness that reminded Angela of countless rooms where she'd had to prove she belonged. Maxwell led her to a small waiting lounge just outside the executive boardroom. "I'll just let the team know we're starting. Someone will be with you in a moment to escort you in," he said before disappearing through the frosted glass door. Angela took a seat, crossing her legs and opening her portfolio again. A moment later, the door behind her opened, and a tall woman in a black pencil skirt and navy blazer approached. "Ms. Mitchell," she asked, her tone clipped but outwardly professional. "I'm Lauren Shaw, Senior Project Manager. I'll take you to the conference suite." Angela stood, nodded politely, and followed. They moved down a different hallway from the one Maxwell had just entered, past empty desks and closed doors. Angela noted the unfamiliarity of the route, but said nothing. She'd memorized the building layout last night. Lauren maintained a swift pace, tapping her tablet absently as they walked. "I understand you're here to present a proposal," Lauren said over her shoulder. "Though I have to admit, we've been getting quite a lot of these lately, some more realistic than others." Angela didn't take the bait. "Mine is based on federal integration plans already in motion," she said simply. Lauren hummed non-committally. Instead of leading her into the conference suite, Lauren stopped outside a small meeting room with a dusty projector and outdated chairs. "This is where we usually conduct intake discussions," she said with a tight smile. "Mr. Maxwell will join you shortly." Angela glanced around, expression neutral. "I was told I'd be presenting in the executive conference room." Lauren shrugged. There must have been a change in the agenda. Happens all the time. Angela walked in and took a seat, waiting. 10 minutes passed. Then 20. No one came. Lauren didn't return. The clock ticked loud in the quiet room, and outside the frosted window, junior staff walked by without noticing her. Finally, Angela stepped out and returned down the hallway, retracing the route on her own. She turned a corner and, through a glass panel, saw the real conference room bustling. Maxwell stood at the head of the table, surrounded by a group of executives, none of whom had been informed she was already in the building. Angela knocked gently and entered. Maxwell's face lit up in confusion and apology. "Ms. Mitchell? We were about to send someone. Lauren brought me to the wrong floor," Angela said, her voice level. "I've been waiting in an unused conference room for over 20 minutes. Maxwell's jaw clenched. "I'll handle it." He gestured for her to sit as murmurs passed through the group. But the disruption wasn't over. As Angela took her seat and opened her folder, the glass doors opened again, and Heather entered, out of place on this floor. "Excuse me," she said quickly, out of breath, holding up a laminated badge. "Security needs to confirm this guest's credentials. We had an irregularity with her ID." Silence dropped like a pin. Angela looked directly at her, unfazed. "Irregularity?" she asked coolly. Heather stammered. "We didn't see her name in the standard system. It's just protocol." Maxwell stood abruptly. "Heather, this is my personal guest. You had no authority to override this appointment. I was just following up to, you weren't asked to," he cut in. The room watched in stunned stillness. Angela slowly reached into her bag and pulled out her federal clearance envelope, the very same she'd handed to Heather downstairs. "You saw this already," she said quietly, "but I'll hold it up for everyone this time, in case it's harder to believe when it's not digital." A few chuckles were muffled, but no one made eye contact with Heather. She froze, then mumbled an apology and exited hastily. Maxwell sighed, pinched the bridge of his nose, and gestured again for Angela to begin. "Let's start over, shall we?" She nodded, took a breath, and stood. But just as she connected her tablet to the presentation screen, Lauren appeared in the doorway. "Oh, Ms. Mitchell, I was just coming to find you. There was a mix-up earlier," she said too quickly. Angela didn't look at her. "Yes," she replied smoothly, loading her slides. "It seems that mix-ups are the specialty here today." Lauren flushed, but said nothing, slipping into a chair as Angela clicked through her opening slide. Strategic Green Transition Federal Co-Investment Proposal. On the screen appeared maps, figures, and a projected economic ripple chart, elegant, precise, and far beyond any intake presentation. And yet, even as the data began unfolding, even as some heads began to nod, some faces soften, there was still an invisible line in the room. The kind you could feel, but not touch. Angela knew it well. She had lived her entire professional life balancing on it. And though Maxwell now gave her his full attention, and a few executives had leaned forward in interest, others still glanced her way with doubt too polished to name. But Angela didn't flinch. She clicked again, page after page, confident, surgical. Still, something in the air told her the fight wasn't over. That despite the numbers, despite the invitation, despite the meeting, someone else in the room was already preparing the next obstacle. And they wouldn't wait long to throw it in her path. Angela's presentation flowed with the precision of a veteran strategist. Each slide, each data point, designed to be airtight. And yet, despite the numbers, despite the clarity, there was an undeniable stiffness in the room. Several of the executives exchanged glances that didn't quite reach enthusiasm, their nods slow, their posture guarded. When she concluded, the room offered polite applause, a few firm head tilts, and one soft, impressive, though even that felt performative. Maxwell thanked her warmly and promised to follow up by noon, assuring her that her proposal would be reviewed thoroughly at the highest level. Angela didn't need to be told what that meant. It meant, "We'll see." As she gathered her materials, Lauren stepped forward, her expression neutral, but her voice edged with pretense. "You're welcome to wait in the investor lounge if Mr. Maxwell would like to debrief," she offered, motioning toward the far side of the floor. Angela nodded, already anticipating the awkwardness ahead. The investor lounge sat in a quiet alcove past the executive offices, behind frosted doors etched with a halcyon crest. It was bright, minimal, with tall windows and mid-century armchairs. Angela walked in and sat near the window, placing her folder carefully on the glass table. Lauren followed a moment later, pushing in a small tray on wheels. On it were a glass of tap water and a cheap paper napkin. "Here you go," Lauren said with a smile too tight to be genuine. "Let me know if you need anything else." Angela looked at the glass. It wasn't the espresso set she'd watched Lauren deliver earlier to another guest in a Navy Tom Ford suit. It wasn't the silver tray or the imported biscotti or even the customized espresso options that had been offered without being asked. It was water, room temperature, from the tap. "Do you serve coffee in this lounge?" Angela asked, her tone calm. "Oh, of course," Lauren replied quickly, as if caught off guard. "I wasn't sure if you'd want one. I'll check with the barista." But she didn't move. Angela simply smiled. "Thank you." Lauren hesitated, nodded, and left, heels clicking away. Angela leaned back slightly and exhaled. She was familiar with this kind of friction. The small slights disguised as oversight, the slow fade into polite neglect. The room had grown quiet again, save for the distant hum of conversation behind the frosted doors. After a few minutes, a tall man in a light gray suit stepped into the lounge. He looked to be in his mid-40s, sharp-featured, with a badge clipped to his lapel that read Daniel Granger VP, Corporate Sales. His gaze swept across the room, pausing the moment he saw her. His brows knit slightly as if processing something incongruent. Then he walked up, his voice firm but not hostile. "Excuse me," he said, tilting his head. "This section is reserved for VIP investors. Can I help you find someone?" Angela didn't rise. She looked up at him with measured patience. "I was invited to wait here by Mr. Maxwell. We just wrapped a strategic review upstairs." Daniel blinked once, then offered a faint smile that didn't quite smooth over his earlier tone. "Ah, I see. Apologies. We've just had some, access issues lately." "Of course," Angela replied simply. "I imagine it happens a lot to guests like me." He opened his mouth to respond, but seemed to think better of it. "Enjoy your stay," he said, then turned and made a call near the barista counter, his eyes flicking back toward her intermittently, as if still unsure. Angela turned her gaze toward the window, her fingers tracing the edge of the glass table, her thoughts calm on the surface, but churning just beneath. Minutes later, a different staff member arrived, this time a younger woman in a soft pink blouse, holding a tray with an espresso, a saucer, and a small biscotti. "Sorry for the wait, ma'am," she said gently. "Would you like sugar or cream?" "No, thank you," Angela replied. She accepted the tray with grace and took a small sip, letting the silence settle. The juxtaposition between the two servers was stark, one bringing water like she was a walk-in, the other delivering espresso like she was an ambassador. And yet, neither surprised her. As she sipped, another group entered the lounge, 3 executives mid-conversation. One of them paused as they passed her, a tall red-haired woman in a pinstriped suit who shot Angela a cursory glance, then whispered something into her colleague's ear. The man laughed quietly, clearly trying not to look back. Angela didn't flinch. She placed her espresso back on the saucer, reopened her folder, and began reviewing notes. The longer she sat in that room, the more invisible she became to the crowd within it, as though her skin, her clothing, her presence coded her as less than, despite the data she'd just delivered upstairs. She didn't speak. She didn't challenge. Not yet. But her silence was not passive. It was strategic. It was the silence of someone who had calculated her entry and planned her exit long before they ever decided she didn't belong. As she turned a page, a familiar voice caught her attention. Daniel again, now standing near the espresso bar, speaking in a hushed tone with Lauren, who had returned. "She's still here?" he asked, not bothering to lower his voice enough. "I thought that was a 15-minute thing. Maxwell's meeting ran over." "Apparently," Lauren replied. She insisted on waiting. Something about a follow-up. "Figures," Daniel muttered. She's probably trying to leverage something. These types always have some agenda. Angela closed her folder slowly, eyes narrowing just enough to process the moment. She rose quietly and walked toward the lounge exit, her stride composed, her espresso left untouched. As she reached the frosted glass door, she paused just for a moment, then turned slightly, making direct eye contact with Daniel. "If you're curious about my agenda," she said, her voice even, "you'll see it in next quarter's revenue stream. It's called Federal Impact Funding." Without waiting for a response, she walked through the door and disappeared into the hallway, leaving Daniel standing in stunned silence as Lauren fumbled for words. But Angela wasn't heading toward the elevator. Not yet. She knew something else was waiting around the next corner. Angela's heels struck the floor with soft, precise rhythm as she returned to the executive boardroom. She had walked the length of the corridor without looking back, the sounds of Daniel's whispered doubt still lingering behind her like faint smoke. But inside her mind, the next battle had already begun. When she stepped back into the conference room, the air felt heavier, charged with something unspoken. Maxwell looked up from his notes, smiling faintly. "Glad you didn't slip away," he said. "We're about to restart for the full panel." Angela nodded and took her place at the head of the presentation table, reconnecting her tablet to the screen. Around the large oak table sat 7 decision-makers, men and women in tailored suits, aged 40 to 60, eyes sharp, expressions guarded. Among them, Gerald Whitman, Chief Financial Officer, leaned back in his chair with fingers steepled and eyes already narrowed in assessment. Angela began again, her tone measured, confident. She introduced the project as Green Loop, a 3-phase, public-private partnership aimed at accelerating sustainable infrastructure in underserved districts, while simultaneously creating long-term tax advantages for municipalities. Her slides were clean, data-backed, and organized to progress from mission to mechanics to projected impact. "Our model," she explained, "draws from the 2024 Federal Clean Cities Act, which allocates $300 million over the next 36 months. Our proposal isn't theoretical, it's a direct application for existing allocations, paired with vetted regional partners." "Excuse me," Gerald said suddenly, waving his hand slightly, "just so I'm clear, do you have an MBA, MS? Mitchell?" Angela paused mid-sentence, not because she was flustered, but because the question was deliberately off-topic. She looked at him and replied evenly, "I hold dual master's degrees, environmental systems and financial engineering, both from Carnegie Mellon." Gerald raised an eyebrow and gave a half-smile. "Ah, not an MBA though. Got it." There was a quiet ripple around the room, a few exchanged looks, the kind that carried subtext. Angela didn't react. She clicked to the next slide, detailing a tax credit leveraging plan that had already passed compliance review with 2 regional treasury boards. "As you can see," she continued, "our team's financial mechanism reduces municipal risk to near zero in the first 12 months. Gerald interrupted again, tilting his head. "I'm curious, what's your experience leading at this scale? Because on paper it's ambitious, but I imagine execution looks different in the real world." Angela kept her voice calm. "I led a 2021 pilot program in Baltimore that delivered a $2.7 million return on a $400,000 grant in under 10 months. The metrics are available in the appendix, if you'd like." Gerald muttered. "Appendix. Sure." He leaned back again, crossing his arms. The air grew thicker. Angela clicked again, moving to the projected 5-year ROI graph, which showed a conservative $420 million return across 6 districts. She noticed another board member glance at her, then at Gerald, then back to the screen, uncertain. "We've also run 4 risk simulations with margin deviation capped at..." "Sorry," Gerald cut in again. "You said your firm is privately held?" "Yes," Angela replied. "We incorporated in 2019. "Interesting," he said. "No outside investors? No board of directors?" Angela gave a faint smile. "We're a closed partnership with 3 strategic advisors and government liaisons. Our compliance documents are in your packet." Gerald made a show of flipping through the folder in front of him, then dropped it with a faint thud. "Well, I'd be lying if I said I wasn't concerned about scale," he said. "We're talking about hundreds of millions. That's heavy. You understand?" "I do," Angela said, "which is why I'm here. This isn't a pitch. It's an invitation." That line landed. Several heads lifted. Even Maxwell leaned in slightly. But just as Angela advanced to her next slide, a financial breakdown by quarter, the projector screen blinked off. She looked down at her tablet. Still connected. She glanced up. The meeting coordinator, a young man in glasses and a navy vest, was standing beside the wall panel. "Apologies," he said quickly. "We need to wrap this session. Another team is scheduled for this room in 5. Angela looked toward Maxwell, who frowned but said nothing. "I was told I had until 11:30, she said. "It's only 11:22. The coordinator hesitated. "We have to prioritize the more time-sensitive portfolios. Orders from scheduling." "If you give me 5 more minutes," Angela said, now addressing the board, "I can show you the fiscal model and risk map." "They are..." "No need," Gerald said, standing up. "I think we've got the gist. Lots of charts, ambitious returns. All very forward-thinking." Angela's spine straightened. "Forward-thinking is what the government is rewarding." Gerald chuckled lightly. "Of course. But in my experience, what looks neat in slides rarely survives contact with politics." "That's why we already engaged 6 State Departments," Angela said. "And all of them signed soft MOUs contingent on this partnership." "Soft," Gerald emphasized. "That's the key word." The screen remained dark. The folder on the table stayed closed. And one by one, chairs began to shift. One executive stood. Another muttered a polite thanks. Maxwell remained seated, jaw tight. Angela gathered her folder, the weight of silence pressing on every inch of her composure. Her eyes met Gerald's one last time. He offered a small smirk and said, "Don't take it personally. Big tables aren't built for everyone." Angela didn't answer. She just turned and walked out of the room, the tap of her heels against the tile carrying more certainty than any reply she could have given. And as she stepped back into the hallway, past the framed mission statements and the echo of a shut-off projector, she realized something. They hadn't just doubted her model. They'd doubted her. And they weren't done yet. Angela returned to the lower level of the building with the same calm dignity she had walked in with, though her thoughts were no longer untouched by frustration. The boardroom door had closed behind her, not with resolution, but with dismissal. She didn't need to be told what had just happened. Her proposal had been shelved without a fair hearing, and the optics had been dressed just enough to look procedural. She passed through the elevator lobby and made her way to the visitors' holding lounge near the administrative wing, where she had been instructed to wait for final paperwork. The lounge was smaller and less polished than the investor suite upstairs. No espresso machines, no floor-to-ceiling windows, just beige chairs and the soft hum of fluorescent lights. Angela took a seat and began typing a brief follow-up email to Maxwell on her tablet, documenting key points that had been cut from her presentation. Across the building, inside a brightly lit operations bullpen, Lauren stood by the central desk with 2 other project leads, flipping through printed briefings, laughing at something only half muted by professionalism. On a nearby screen, the internal task management dashboard displayed the title green loop status, under review, but that status was about to change. At exactly 12:06 p.m., an email landed in the inbox of the Partnership Selection Committee, marked priority, internal use only. The subject line read, "Angela Mitchell recommendation, do not advance." The body of the message was brief. After preliminary review and board-level engagement, the candidate does not meet the experiential threshold for federal-scale execution. Suggest no further consideration. Lacking proven leadership with market-level implementation. GW, of course, was Gerald Whitman. Attached below was a short bullet list that said nothing of her data, her modeling, her pilot programs, or her existing state endorsements. Instead, it listed vague concerns, unclear fiscal track record, unfamiliarity with board protocols, insufficient backing. The recipients included senior analysts, evaluators, and internal interns, many of whom had never met Angela or seen her full proposal. Down the hall, one of those interns, a first-year MBA candidate named Evan Chun, was printing documentation for the next phase of project vetting. He had been asked to prepare brief summaries of all presentations under review and to flag any late submitted financials that had not been entered into the digital record. As the printer whirred to life, Evan glanced over and saw a thick packet labeled Green Loop Phase 3 Fiscal Map Distribution Model C. He pulled it from the tray, flipped through the first few pages, and paused. The charts were dense but meticulously designed. Line items coded by region, projected drawdown curves, three-tiered tax benefit structures, all cross-verified with public data. Evan blinked, scanning faster. He wasn't an expert yet, but he'd reviewed dozens of project summaries, and none of them came close to this level of granularity. He set the packet aside on the counter, ready to include it with the rest of the shortlist files, when a voice behind him said, "What's that?" He turned to see Lauren, arms crossed, coffee in hand. "Just a late fiscal for the Green Loop file," Evan replied. "Looks pretty strong. It wasn't in the slide deck earlier. I think she was cut off." Lauren stepped forward, took the folder from his hand without asking, and skimmed the top sheet. Her eyes narrowed. "Where did this come from?" "I just pulled it off the print queue," Evan said. "She must have sent it before the meeting. It wasn't in the shared folder yet." Lauren stared at it for a moment longer, then, without a word, tore the entire packet cleanly in half. "You don't need to worry about this one," she said coolly. "It's not advancing." Evan froze. "But this model is one of the most detailed I've seen. Even Gerald said we don't have enough Tier 2 candidates with state-level backing." This isn't about the math," Lauren interrupted sharply. "Trust me, this one's a non-starter. Not the right profile. There's no political runway for it." She dropped the two halves of the fiscal packet into the shred bin beside the copier and walked away. Evan stood there, stunned, the hum of the printer still buzzing behind him. In his gut, he knew something wasn't right. But he also knew how things worked around here. His role wasn't to challenge senior leads. Not if he wanted to stay past this rotation. Across the building, Angela checked her inbox. No reply from Maxwell. She refreshed once, twice, then stared at the clock. 12:34. Still nothing. She took a deep breath and looked out at the glass wall across the corridor where staff bustled, purposefully avoiding eye contact. Her tablet buzzed gently, an auto-generated message confirming the close of her internal application status. "Thank you for your interest in partnering with Halcyon Strategies. At this time, we have chosen to move forward with other candidates more aligned with our institutional capabilities." Angela read it slowly, her thumb hovering above the screen. There was no contact name, no explanation, no notes, just a sterile sentence designed to sound final. She locked the screen and leaned back in her chair, letting her mind settle into stillness. It wasn't just about rejection, it was the orchestration behind it. The careful removal, the quiet deletion, the way even the strongest numbers could be erased with a shrug from the right person. She folded her hands and closed her eyes for a long breath, then stood, collected her things, and walked toward the front desk. As she passed the glass wall, she saw Evan at the copier, staring at the shred bin. Their eyes met for a brief second. He looked as if he wanted to say something, but he didn't. And Angela didn't ask. She just walked on, the silence between them filled with too many unsaid truths to count. But one of those truths was already shifting, and it wouldn't stay buried much longer. Angela walked slowly toward the exit lounge of Halcyon Strategies, her tablet secured in her leather portfolio, her back straight, her expression unreadable. The hallway stretched long and bright, lined with success plaques and framed partnerships from previous decades. Evidence of a legacy she had nearly stepped into, had nearly reshaped. Just hours earlier, she had stood before their board and offered them a new way forward, data-backed, federally endorsed, financially sound. Now, she was walking out as if she'd never been there at all. Her internal rejection had arrived, sterile and absolute. And while she had expected resistance, the precision of the dismissal struck with something colder than incompetence. It was surgical exclusion. She passed the glassed meeting rooms where junior teams debriefed, laughing softly over boxed lunches, not realizing she was still within earshot. On the left, a breakout room door was half open, and inside, Gerald stood with two of his colleagues, sleeves rolled up, coffee in hand, confidence unchecked. "I mean, come on," he said with a smirk, his voice casual but intentionally loud enough to carry. "If she wants to make an impact, she should open an Etsy store. Sell recycled macrame or something. That'd be more her lane than handling federal funding." Laughter followed, tight and complicit. One of the others, a younger associate, attempted a grimace, as if unsure whether the joke had gone too far, but said nothing. Gerald added, "Can't expect to run billion-dollar proposals when you've never even run a real firm. She's got grit, I'll give her that. But grit doesn't pay back investors." Angela didn't stop walking. She didn't flinch. But she felt every word strike the space between her shoulder blades, like pebbles tossed by bored children pretending they weren't throwing stones. Further down the hall, Lauren stood near the reception desk, reviewing files with the scheduling assistant. When she saw Angela approaching, she stepped slightly into her path, smiling with the kind of polished coldness that looked like hospitality from far away. "I hope we weren't too hard on you," Lauren said sweetly, tone wrapped in glass. "This place has high expectations, but I'm sure there's space somewhere else for your kind of work." Angela raised an eyebrow. "My kind?" Lauren tilted her head slightly, as if surprised by the question. "Independent, visionary, solo parent-led, that kind of thing." Angela didn't answer, but Lauren wasn't done. She leaned in just slightly and whispered, "You're a single mom, right? I saw it on your intake form. Honestly, it makes sense now. That dreamer energy, it's sweet, but it doesn't fly in places like this." Angela looked at her, eyes steady, unblinking. Lauren chuckled awkwardly. "Hey, I'm not judging. I mean, juggling a kid and trying to pitch to the federal government? That takes guts. Or maybe just really high hopes." The implication landed like poison wrapped in paper. Angela offered no expression, but Lauren's voice lowered a notch more, pretending now to be helpful. "Listen, I know it didn't work out, but don't be discouraged. These rooms aren't easy to break into. Most people don't even make it past the receptionist, right?" She winked. "But at least you got in." Angela's silence was deafening. It wasn't the silence of shock or defeat or confusion. It was the silence of someone who had already seen the long game, who understood that their value wasn't validated by temporary gatekeepers. A silence not of surrender, but calculation. Still, Lauren smiled triumphantly, as if she'd scored a final point. Angela turned toward the elevators without a word. Behind her, Lauren watched her go, confident she'd just given someone a reality check. As Angela stepped into the elevator, she caught her own reflection in the mirrored wall. She adjusted the strap of her bag, watching her expression for any sign of falter. There was none, not even now. The elevator descended slowly, each floor a quiet reminder of the doors that had just closed upstairs. But Angela wasn't replaying the insults. She was assembling something different, fragments of every microaggression, every subtle exclusion, every document lost or accidentally omitted. The glances, the smirks, the jokes they thought she couldn't hear. Not because they mattered in themselves, but because they were data, just like fiscal curves and ROI charts, just like legal compliance and scalability metrics. Every slight, every oversight was a data point. And Angela had always known how to read data. When the elevator doors opened to the lobby, the receptionist at the front desk, Heather, glanced up, clearly unsure whether to make eye contact. She didn't say anything. Angela didn't pause. She walked out into the glass atrium, sunlight flooding through the skylights, as if unaware that a war had just been fought inside the polished walls. The security guard who had scanned her ID that morning gave a small nod, then looked away. Outside, the world carried on. Cars passed. Suits strode across pavement. Taxis idled. She stepped to the curb, opened her phone, and tapped twice. The screen lit up with a secure app, and she entered a string of characters. The name of the internal file folder she created blinked to life. HSI Contingency Archive. She uploaded the final version of the fiscal appendix, the one that had been shredded, the one Lauren had thrown away. Then she opened her calendar. There was still another meeting scheduled on her agenda, one that no one at Halcyon had seen coming. And this time, the room wouldn't be filled with skeptics. It would be filled with decision makers. Because Halcyon hadn't just rejected a pitch, they had rejected their only key to unlocking federal alignment with the new infrastructure bill. And Angela Mitchell hadn't come here to ask for their approval. She had come to evaluate them. The next morning, the lobby of Halcyon Strategies buzzed with its usual rhythm. Heels clicking across polished stone, badges flashing green at the security turnstiles, low chatter over double-shot lattes. No one gave a second glance when Angela Mitchell stepped back through the same glass doors she had exited less than 24 hours prior. She was dressed nearly identically to the day before: professional slacks, a tailored blazer, calm eyes, and quiet authority. Heather glanced up from the reception desk and froze mid-sentence. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard as Angela approached. "Ms. Mitchell," she said slowly, standing straighter now, voice cautious. Angela offered her a nod but didn't pause. "I'm expected," she said simply, holding up her visitor badge, no longer labeled applicant, but now marked in red as Authorized Liaison OED/DOE. Heather blinked, unsure what the acronym meant, but registered the weight of it instantly. Before she could respond, a tall man emerged from the private elevator behind reception. "Ms. Mitchell," he said firmly, voice cutting through the lobby like a blade through silk. "Director Langston is waiting upstairs. Right this way." The man, Thomas Wren, Director of Government Relations, gestured respectfully, motioning Angela toward the executive lift. As the doors closed behind them, Heather stared at the control panel. The lift was keyed to level 61, access restricted to Halcyon's inner executive suite, the place where only core board members and federal liaisons were allowed. Upstairs, in the sleek war room, surrounded by bulletproof glass and steel-paneled walls, the board was already gathered. But this wasn't the same boardroom Angela had presented in yesterday. This room didn't have snacks or clickers or nameplates. This room had legal teams, silent note-takers, federal compliance reps, and a single long table lined with straight-back chairs and wired microphones. At the head sat Robert Maxwell, CEO of Halcyon Strategies, his usual confidence now tempered by visible tension. He stood as Angela entered. "Thank you for returning," he said evenly. "Would you like something to drink?" "No, thank you," Angela replied, taking her seat across from him. Her leather portfolio landed softly on the table. She opened it slowly, deliberately, and removed a single document, an embossed envelope bearing the seal of the United States Department of Energy. With gloved hands, she unfolded the letter, then slid it across the table toward Maxwell. "As of Monday," she began, her voice clear, "I was officially appointed Strategic Federal Liaison and Project Owner for Greenscale, the National Clean Grid Initiative under the DOE's Infrastructure Acceleration Mandate. This appointment includes full authority to audit, assess, and approve institutional consultants on behalf of the department." A silence fell across the room. Even Maxwell blinked. The letter bore the wet signature of the Deputy Secretary and a federal validation watermark. It wasn't a proposal. It was a directive. "This includes," she continued, "power to reassign or remove potential vendors who fail to meet compliance, ethics, or procedural transparency standards." The general counsel seated beside Maxwell leaned forward and whispered something into his ear. Maxwell's jaw twitched. "We weren't informed of this update," he said carefully. "Our understanding was that Green Loop was one of several candidates. That was before Greenscale absorbed Green Loop and two other DOE-aligned initiatives under a unified pilot," Angela replied. "The consolidation was completed last Thursday. Notices were sent out to senior procurement networks Friday morning." She placed a second envelope on the table, this one stamped private, board eyes only. "This contains your firm's pre-approval eligibility summary," she said. "The board may review it before I move forward with recommendations to the Federal Compliance Unit." Maxwell hesitated before opening the envelope. Inside, a trifold report outlined Halcyon standing, qualified, but flagged for procedural inconsistencies, with a pending red line over project evaluation bias. "We noticed," Angela added, her tone even, that one of your key internal reports from yesterday, specifically the fiscal review for Greenloop, was never logged in your data system. A printed version was recovered from an intern's terminal. Shredded. No one spoke. One executive cleared his throat and looked down. Angela's eyes moved slowly around the table. This isn't about one bad decision, she said. It's about whether your firm is structured to collaborate on public initiatives with accountability. You're not being punished. You're being evaluated. And right now, what I'm seeing isn't alignment. It's avoidance. Maxwell took a deep breath. May I ask, he began, voice slow, why you chose to return in person? You could have submitted this electronically. Angela nodded. Because I wanted you to look me in the eye. You made decisions about my capability without facts. You passed judgment on my model, my team, and my position based on optics. Now I want you to understand something very clearly. What you dismissed as too ambitious yesterday is now your only remaining path into the federal Tier 1 implementation matrix. One of the other executives finally spoke. If we were to re-engage, start fresh, would the previous evaluation impact our position? That's under review, Angela replied. But know this, my role isn't just about strategy anymore. It's oversight. Across the table, Gerald was conspicuously absent. Angela noticed his nameplate flip down, his seat empty. She didn't ask where he was. She already knew. Some people sense storms before they arrived. Others waited until the lightning touched their skin. She stood slowly, her documents collected with precise hands. I'll be meeting with your sustainability lead this afternoon, she added. If this firm wishes to remain a federal partner, I suggest your internal house be in order by then. She turned toward the door, passing a glass panel where Lauren, now seated with compliance counsel, stared at her in wide-eyed disbelief. Angela didn't stop, didn't speak, didn't even blink. Angela stepped into the adjoining strategic planning chamber, where a smaller group of directors had been waiting. This time, not to assess her, but to be assessed. She was calm, composed, and surgical as always, but there was now a deliberate sharpness to her presence, the kind that made even the most seasoned executives sit straighter in their chairs. The room was outfitted not with presentation screens, but with compliance monitors, real-time market access reports, and federal procurement maps, displaying 3 colored blocks across the eastern seaboard, each representing one of 3 consulting firms shortlisted for Greenscale's Tier 1 advisory contract. Angela placed her portfolio gently on the table, connected a secure line through the provided terminal, and began without preamble. As you've likely been briefed, she said, Greenscale has finalized its shortlist of 3 institutional partners eligible for full-cycle federal alignment under the Department of Energy's Clean Infrastructure Pathway. Halcyon Strategies was one of them. As of 9:17 a.m. this morning, that status has changed. The sentence dropped like glass on concrete. No one moved. Angela continued. Following an internal review of Halcyon's board behavior, staff conduct, compliance protocol, and ethical evaluation patterns, we have initiated a provisional disqualification under Section 9.2 of the Federal Partner Integrity Mandate. This means Halcyon is no longer eligible to receive Tier 1 advisory access for the 2025-2029 implementation phase. Robert Maxwell sat frozen, fingers laced tightly on the table in front of him, eyes fixed on the woman across from him, who now held the power to either bury his firm or keep it breathing. Ms. Mitchell, he said slowly, I was under the impression that this session was to address clarification, not deliver a final ruling. Angela's eyes didn't flinch. Clarification was offered yesterday, she replied. Today is about consequence. The director of partnerships, a woman named Sandrine Wynn, spoke next, her voice tight with urgency. Forgive me, but may I ask what specific violation prompted this action? We've had difficult reviews before, but this seems unprecedented. Angela nodded. It is. But the mandate gives full authority to trigger disqualification when there is clear evidence of systemic bias in procurement behavior, especially toward underrepresented or federally endorsed applicants. She reached into her folder again and produced a printed transcript, time-stamped and compiled from both audio and written records. Yesterday, Your team actively suppressed qualifying data from an invited federal partner. A fiscal brief submitted within deadline was destroyed before entry into your system. An internal email was distributed recommending disqualification using language inconsistent with DOE evaluation guidelines. And finally, she turned a page. Multiple verbal exchanges were logged where the applicant was demeaned, questioned about credentials unrelated to project criteria, and directed away from formal presentation opportunities. She placed the document on the table. These aren't just oversights. They're indicators of institutional resistance to qualified partnerships that do not match preconceived profiles. Maxwell swallowed hard. Is this irreversible? Angela's gaze held. For this cycle, yes. She allowed the pause to sit heavy before adding, the department requires that contracted firms reflect not only financial capability, but also social integrity. You failed that test. A silence stretched through the room, broken only by the subtle rustling of suit jackets as board members shifted uncomfortably in their chairs. Then Maxwell spoke again, but this time not to Angela. He turned slowly to face his executive team, his voice now taut with something between confusion and fury. Who, he asked, was directly responsible for handling Ms. Mitchell's file when it first arrived? The question wasn't rhetorical. His tone demanded names. The room was still. Then, one by one, heads turned, first toward the back, where Lauren stood behind the glass wall, pale and unmoving. Then toward the other door, where Heather had just entered with a notepad and stopped mid-step, realizing far too late that she was walking into the eye of the storm. Gerald, notably, remained absent, his empty seat now a vacuum of accountability that only made his guilt more pronounced. Lauren Shaw, Maxwell said coldly. And Heather, what's your last name again? Carver, Heather whispered. Heather Carver. Both of you, Maxwell continued, now with a steely professionalism that barely veiled his rage, will remain after this session. HR and legal will be joining us shortly. He turned toward Angela again, but the authority in the room no longer belonged to him. She spoke before he could. For the record, Angela said, I didn't come here to seek vengeance. I came to offer partnership. But when your people chose to see less instead of more, you lost more than a contract. You lost trust. And in federal work, trust is currency. Maxwell's face was a mask of tightly restrained emotion, equal parts regret, embarrassment, and dawning realization. Sandrine tried to salvage the moment. Ms. Mitchell, if this firm were to submit a remedial action plan, internal restructuring, external audits, DEI recalibration, could we petition for future review in the next fiscal year? Angela nodded slowly. Yes, but it would have to come from a completely restructured proposal team, and the names currently on record would disqualify you automatically from primary roles. Another silence. Then Maxwell spoke again, almost to himself. How did we not know who you were? Angela offered the faintest of smiles. Because you never asked. You assumed I came here to pitch. You never once considered I might be holding the scorecard. The words landed with finality. No dramatics. No raised voice. Just undeniable truth, spoken by the very woman they had once written off as a statistical misfit. Across the room, Lauren took a step back, as if trying to make herself disappear into the wall. Heather looked as though she wanted to run. The interns behind the compliance monitor whispered quietly, now realizing they'd just witnessed something historic. Angela gathered her materials one last time, placed her tablet inside her portfolio, and rose. She paused at the threshold, one hand on the steel door. I'll forward my recommendations to the oversight board by noon, she said. Your final eligibility summary will be sent within the hour. If any corrections are to be made, they'll begin today. She didn't wait for a response. She stepped out into the corridor where the hum of high-level consequence had already begun to vibrate through the air. The fallout began before Angela even reached the ground floor. As the elevator descended with its soft mechanical hum, Halcyon's internal communication channels exploded into motion, first with terse legal memos, then with scheduled emergency sessions, and finally with a company-wide directive from the CEO himself. When the doors opened to the lobby, Angela stepped out to a vastly different atmosphere than the one she had entered earlier. The receptionist, who once barely acknowledged her now, stood stiffly at attention, murmuring a subdued "good day," as if rehearsed. She offered a polite nod in return, but did not slow her pace. Behind her, in the upper floors of the building, the executive conference room had gone silent following her departure. Maxwell sat motionless for a long moment, hands clasped in front of his mouth, eyes locked on the door she had just exited. The board members remained seated, uncomfortable but silent, as if the air had been sucked out of the room. Then Maxwell turned to his assistant. "Draft a full internal communication," he said sharply. Subject line: accountability in real time. I want it sent to all departments in the next hour. He stood and left the room without waiting for questions. The statement went live at 11:12 a.m. It was short, direct, and impossible to misinterpret. Team, today Halcyon Strategies has been officially removed from consideration for the Greenscale Federal Initiative, a project that would have represented our largest strategic contract in over a decade. This outcome was not due to capability nor competitiveness, but to conduct. I regret to inform you that this was the result of internal behaviors that fell short of our standards, and, more importantly, our values. We must be better, and we will be. Effective immediately, personnel reviews will be conducted, and leadership will take corrective action. Robert Maxwell, CEO. The email hit inboxes across every division like a shockwave. In the compliance department, interns huddled silently around their monitors, rereading the final sentence over and over. In the strategy bullpen, teams that had spent weeks preparing market analyses now stared blankly at their spreadsheets, knowing it was all for nothing. But in 3 specific corners of the company, the impact landed far deeper. Gerald Whitman received the formal suspension notice by direct courier, delivered to his office in a sealed envelope stamped "immediate action required." It instructed him to step away from all decision-making responsibilities pending investigation into ethics violations and non-compliant internal communication. He stared at it for a full minute before tossing it onto his desk and leaning back in his chair, the reality beginning to settle around him like a fog. No more boardrooms. No more steering the financial narratives. No more whispering jokes that passed as harmless banter. The consequences had arrived. Meanwhile, on the second floor, Lauren Shaw sat alone in an HR glass chamber, eyes fixed on the framed photograph of Halcyon's founder on the wall, while her reassignment terms were reviewed. The decision came swiftly. She would be removed from her current role and placed in a developmental track under internal training. The department's official title was Organizational Alignment and Values Education, but everyone inside the company knew what that really meant. It was where they sent people who had become liabilities but weren't worth a lawsuit. She had tried to defend herself, of course, claimed misunderstanding, miscommunication, even misinterpretation of intent. But the transcripts didn't lie, nor did the shredded documents. Her signature had been traced on the print order. Her voice had been identified in the hallway recordings. Intent didn't matter anymore, only consequence. And then there was Heather, the receptionist who had been the first gatekeeper in Angela's long walk through bias, was now seated with the administrative chief, her cheeks pale, her voice trembling as she recounted the events of the previous day for a formal incident report. She had been instructed to document every detail, her words, her tone, her decision to verify credentials despite a confirmed appointment, and her reaction when she learned who Angela truly was. Her hands shook as she typed. She hadn't thought it would come to this. She had believed, somewhere deep down, that people like Angela didn't really have power, that politeness could hide prejudice, and no one would notice. She had been wrong. Across Halcyon's intranet, message boards buzzed with guarded speculation. No one mentioned names directly, HR filters were quick, but phrases like misjudged candidate, blown opportunity, and internal culture check appeared in strings of hushed conversations. In the quiet corner of the building's server room, Evan Shun, the intern who had seen the fiscal packet before it was destroyed, received a short, encrypted message from Maxwell's office. It read, "We appreciate your honesty and discretion. Your rotation has been extended through Q3. Consider this a formal commendation. He read the message twice, then closed the tab. For the first time that day, he smiled. On the 15th floor, Maxwell sat in his private office, with blinds half drawn and phone muted. The chaos was contained for now, but the damage was permanent. He looked down at the binder labeled Greenscale Strategic Phase 1 and flipped it closed. Then, for reasons he couldn't fully articulate, he opened his internal notes and typed a single sentence under the heading Lessons Learned. He wrote, "Never let bias waste brilliance." Then he added, "Meet with Angela Mitchell again, not as a client, as a benchmark." Outside, the city pulsed as usual. Cars blared, crosswalks clicked, buildings rose and stretched toward the sky. But inside Halcyon Strategies, a quiet reckoning had begun. Files were being reopened. Names were being reconsidered. Procedures were being rewritten. Not because of a PR crisis, not because of legal threats, but because one woman had walked into their building with data, dignity, and truth, and walked out holding their future in her hand. 3 months had passed since the fallout at Halcyon Strategies, but the air inside the building still carried the weight of transformation. The walls had been repainted, the DI charter reframed and mounted in every department, and a new department had emerged on the 12th floor, Organizational Renewal and Inclusive Leadership. It was created not just as a gesture of damage control, but as a long overdue acknowledgement that culture, like strategy, needed to be built with intention. Lauren Shaw stepped off the elevator that morning with a portfolio in hand and a strange tightness in her chest. Her heels clicked with less certainty now, her once practiced smile no longer automatic. She had been assigned to Halcyon's mandatory leadership recalibration course, a multi-week program designed to confront unconscious bias, structural exclusion, and the interpersonal dynamics of power. She had attended the first 2 sessions half-heartedly, sitting at the back, nodding when necessary, deflecting when challenged. But today's session was different. Today's speaker had been marked in bold red letters across the digital invite. Angela Mitchell, Special Consultant, Federal Private Culture Integration. Lauren paused just outside the conference room door, unsure whether to enter. She told herself it wasn't shame that made her hesitate, but somewhere deep beneath her carefully folded blazer, shame sat like a stone. She pushed the door open and stepped inside. The room was full, department heads, compliance officers, a few senior associates. No one spoke above a whisper. At the front of the room, standing beside a wide digital screen, was Angela. She wore a soft gray blouse, tailored black slacks, and no visible badge or lanyard. She didn't need one. Her presence alone commanded the space. When her eyes met Lauren's across the room, there was no flicker of recognition, no lingering scorn, just a calm, unwavering acknowledgement. Lauren chose a seat near the center. Not hidden, not bold, just present. Angela began without fanfare. "Bias is rarely about hate," she said. "It's often about assumption. And assumption, when repeated inside systems of power, becomes policy. And policy, when unchecked, becomes exclusion." She didn't speak in condemnation. Her voice was steady, deliberate. She moved through her slides with ease. But most of the room wasn't watching the slides. They were watching her. Angela didn't retell the story of what had happened. She didn't need to. The people in that room knew. Some had whispered about it. Others had read the internal memos. A few had seen it unfold firsthand. Instead, she used case studies, anonymized but familiar. She dissected moments where a mistake was really a message, where oversight was actually a decision. Lauren watched as Angela spoke to the room with a quiet strength that felt both unsettling and healing. Halfway through, Angela invited the group to participate in a thought exercise. "Imagine," she said, "a candidate walks into your company with data stronger than 90% of your existing partners, but doesn't fit the visual template of what you're used to seeing in boardrooms. What is the first question you ask yourself? What is the second? And which one controls your next action?" The silence that followed was not discomfort, it was reflection. Angela let it sit, let it work its way through the room. At the end of the session, she closed her laptop and offered a final thought. Change doesn't come from compliance. It comes from clarity, from knowing where you were blind and choosing to see differently next time. The room erupted into quiet, sustained applause. No one moved for a full 10 seconds after she stepped away from the podium. Angela packed her materials slowly. Some attendees approached with handshakes, with thank yous. Lauren didn't move. She stayed seated until the room began to empty, then finally stood. Her steps toward Angela felt heavier than they should have. When she reached her, Angela turned, sensing her approach. "Ms. Mitchell," Lauren began, voice quieter than usual. Angela didn't correct her. "I just wanted to say I read your follow-up report," Lauren continued. "The one you submitted to the oversight board. I noticed you didn't name anyone in particular. You could have, and I would have deserved it." Angela looked at her, calm but clear. "The system already knows the names," she said gently. "Calling them out would have been about ego. What I care about is whether they change." Lauren swallowed. "I am trying," she said, "even when no one's watching." Angela gave a small nod. "That's when it counts." She began to turn away, but Lauren added, "I was wrong about you. I was wrong about a lot of things." Angela paused, then said, "You were wrong about who I was. But maybe now you're starting to be right about who you can be." Lauren blinked, caught off guard by the grace in those words. She stepped back, letting the space between them fill with something more honest than apology: accountability. Angela left the room shortly after, her day far from over. Down in the lobby, Heather sat in the cafe corner, nursing a lukewarm cup of coffee, watching the internal chat thread scroll across her tablet. She had seen Angela's name on the training calendar that morning and almost called in sick. But something pulled her in: curiosity, guilt, maybe both. She hadn't dared attend the session itself, but when she saw Angela stepping into the elevator, alone, she stood abruptly and followed. She caught up just as Angela passed the second-floor mezzanine. "Ms. Mitchell," she called softly. Angela turned. Heather approached slowly, eyes lowered at first, then raised. "I know you probably don't want to hear from me," she began, "and I don't expect you to respond. But I've been thinking about that day. Every day, actually." Angela said nothing. Heather continued, "I remember the way I looked at you, like you didn't belong. And then I read the announcement. I read your credentials. I watched you walk into that boardroom and walk out with everything we thought belonged to us." Her voice trembled. "And the thing is, you could have crushed us. You had every right. But you didn't. You gave us space to change instead of room to collapse. I just wanted to say thank you for not choosing to destroy us, for choosing to teach us instead." Angela looked at her for a long moment, then said, "People learn best when they're forced to face themselves." Heather nodded, eyes damp. "I'm trying to face mine." Angela offered a small smile. "Keep looking. You'll find someone worth becoming." Then she turned and walked away, the quiet echo of her footsteps fading into the atrium. Outside, sunlight pooled across the marble steps as the revolving doors opened to the world beyond. Angela stepped through, not as someone who had won, but as someone who had revealed what power looks like when it's quiet, what strength feels like when it forgives, what change requires when it finally arrives, not in punishment, but in reflection, and sometimes in redemption. Before you go, if this story moved you, take a second to hit that like button and subscribe for more powerful narratives just like this one. We'd love to hear from you. What part of Angela's journey hit you the hardest? Was it the moment she revealed her true role, or the quiet grace she showed even when she could have retaliated? And one more thing, where in the world are you watching from right now? Drop your city or country in the comments. It's always incredible to see how far these stories travel.